afternoon, everyone. Today we begin our sixth study in the book of Isaiah. And today, unlike having a pre recorded lecture, we have an interactive class. And so joining me today will be Brad Collins, Stan Leopard, and Michael Malloy. And I'm very thankful to have them with us today and looking forward to their comments and their feedback as we go through the class. Other than that, we're going to continue to go through the book of Isaiah, and we're going to continue to be working on the second major section within the book, where we'll be focusing on judgment on Judah and her invaders. So again, remember we've started off talking about Judah, and now we've expanded the circle out, and we're looking at invaders that are be oppressing her as well. And so last time we finished up chapter 7 and chapter 8, and today we hope to cover chapter 9 through 10, and then get into a little bit of 11 and maybe 12. And today we'll be focused on the complete and justified destruction of both Israel and Syria. And this can be a little bit confusing when we talk about Israel. Depending on where we are in the history of the Israelites, we may be thinking about the nation as a whole. But in this study, we're well past the dividing of the kingdom. And so when we speak of Israel, most of the time, we're speaking of the northern kingdom whose capital is Samaria. And so that presented itself as one of the major threats during the time of King Ahaz. And that's how we'll be referring to it today. So we'll be looking at both Israel and Assyria as being the next major threat coming in after those as we go through chapters 9 and 10 tonight. All right, so for the first question that we have to think about, we'll be thinking about the destruction that was going to be coming upon the northern kingdom, on Israel, on Samaria. And God has a few observations that shows how obstinate and how rebellious they really were. So as you were reading through the text and thinking about these in chapters 9, what things did you pick up on that showed how obstinate and how rebellious the northern kingdom was?
Trevor, number one, he outright identifies their attitude in verse 9 there when he says, they say this in pride and arrogance of heart.
Mm-hmm.
But then we have a quote, whether this was said verbatim by somebody in Israel, maybe not. Perhaps this is just more the attitude that they demonstrated. But the quote's this way. The bricks have fallen down, but we will rebuild with hewn stones. The sycamores are cut down, but we will replace them with cedars. And of course, God goes on to say, no, you won't. They think that they're going to recover, but God says, no, you won't. In verse 12, he says, the Syrians will be before and the Philistines behind, and they shall devour Israel with an open mouth. So God really, he doesn't give them any hope that whatever start they might make on rebuilding, that they'll ever get to finish.
Right, exactly. So we normally think about this as really some optimism and some national pride, in the sense that even though these things are going to happen to them, we're going to get right back to it. We're going to rebuild it. It's going to be bigger. It's going to be better. And we may have had bricks before, but now we're going to have hewn stones. And we may have had sycamores, but now we'll have cedar trees. So they actually think that they're going to rebuild it, but they're going to make it even better than it was before. And so by them, as Brad said, whether this was literally what somebody said or this was just the thought that represented the entire nation, we have them just shrugging off punishment and them just being oblivious to God's action, God's work, and God's destruction on them, and just being determined that they're going to persist and continue without any form of repentance whatsoever. And so, as Brad mentioned, God calls this out as a pride and arrogance of heart. And this is not an uncommon thing. This is something that we would continue to see in many nations. Malachi, speaking about Edom in 1 through 4, has very similar language where Edom was determined to come back, rebuild, but God says, no, they will rebuild, but I will tear it down. And so this is something that we see in many different cases. So this punishment would continue until either one, they submitted to it, they recognized and they repented, or else they were going to be destroyed. And as we know by this point, there was no humility, no room for repentance in these people. They were bent on destruction and stubbornness. So one thing that I want to notice is this is something that You often hear the expression Rome wasn't built in a day, and the other side of the coin is Rome wasn't destroyed in a day either. And what we're going to see is in these kingdoms, there's many different things that will be taken apart, many different aspects of their nation that will be destroyed before the fall finally comes. And so this invasive force, this invasions that will be coming in on them, this will be a big threat, but there will be other things that will also participate in the destruction as well. All right. Anybody else have any other comments on question 14 before we move on to the next one?
That just reminded me of Psalms 127, the first couple of verses there. Unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. Unless the Lord guards the city, the watchman keeps awake in vain. It is vain for you to rise up early, to retire late, to eat the bread of painful labors, for he gives his beloved even in his sleep. So, yeah, no matter how good the stones were, no matter how big the timbers were, vanity, an exercise in vanity.
Right, right. Yeah, hey, we can think of the Tower of Babel and many other examples of people that had big dreams, but they were contrary to God, and so ultimately they would be destroyed. All right. So as we look at Israel and their destruction, we're told about different aspects of their society that were torn down. So let's just start with the first part of the question. What aspects of the society did God address directly? Did he cut off in one day, as he says?
Well, he said the head and the tail, and as I understand that, he's talking about the leaders who had not done that, they had not led Israel like they were supposed to, and then he says the prophet who teaches lies. So you had a few good men who were saying what God had to say, but they were not being listened to because they weren't saying what people wanted to hear. And
Right.
so God said, I'm going to get rid of the leaders and I'm going to get rid of those lying prophets.
Yep, exactly. Now, as you think about that, at least one thing that's surprising to me is that these should have been the people that should have been of the highest character, the highest integrity. These also should have been the people that, if there was anybody to kind of stand in the gap, that would be willing to take the hits and do the unpopular thing, whether it was the political leaders who felt the responsibility of their nation, or it was the religious leaders who felt the spiritual responsibility of their people. You would expect these people to stand up. But yet what we see is they're actually kind of at the forefront, and that they're actually leading this and being one of the primary causes of this. So from the narrative, we know, going back to Kings and Chronicles, that King Ahaz personally, as a king, he led in the moral decline of this. And as we've noted back in the history and the narrative, then when he was in Syria and he saw the idols and the altars in Damascus, then he sent to the high priest, or to the priest Uriah, and sent him a copy of the design and asked him to make an altar just like that. And he did. Now he's not one of the prophets, but this is a spiritual leader. And even though I don't think we read about any prophets at this time that were false prophets and leading the people astray specifically by name, like certainly during the days of Ahab, or during the days of Jeremiah, there were false prophets that are called out by name. So we have some idea of what these people would have been like, even though we may not know them by name and know any specific events. So we have kind of leaders at both ends, that whether it's very high and very low, the palm tree being a very tall tree and the bulrush being a very small base, low flower around the water's edge. So we have kind of both ends of the spectrum that are being represented by these leaders that are causing people to go astray. But at the same time, I think it's important to notice that the nation, the people, at least some majority of them, were not just completely ignorant and just completely innocent in this matter. They were willingly following along. So just reading along in the verse there, it says the prophet teaches lies. He is the tail. The leaders of this people cause them to err, and those who are led by them are destroyed. So at least I might be at first inclined to think, well, this is not really fair. These people are innocent in this matter. But that's not the case. So the Lord will have no joy in their young men, nor have mercy on their fatherless and widows. For everyone is a hypocrite and an evildoer, and every mouth speaks folly. So this is something that was pervasive. The leaders led in this. They didn't do anything to stop it. Um, but yet at the same time, it seems the people love to have it so. So we have a very justified case of the blind leading the blind, and both of them falling into the ditch. And then one thing we know just from other accounts in history, in Hosea 8:4, there God complains about the people setting up kings and princes, but not by him. They were not his choice. It was a representation of the people. And then after Jehoiada died, we read about 2 Chronicles 24, 17 through 18, how the people came to the king and they persuaded him and they leaned on him and pressured him into going into idolatry after Jehoiada's death. And so it's very hard for leaders to lead without the support of the people. And oftentimes they are a representation of them. And we see that in this case as well. One of the other things that's interesting is this phrase, and we're going to see this more than once. For all this, his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. So we're going to see these different ways of punishment and destruction, but yet at the end of each of these, God's hand, like it's in a position to attack, in a position to strike, and it's still outstretched, still ready to smite the people. And he's not done. He's not finished yet. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit. We'll have a question focusing on that, but please pay attention to that as we go through. All right. Any other thoughts on this section before we move on into the next question?
Trevor, we covered in the junior high class today the book of Hosea. We finished up the book of Hosea. And something stood out to me reading this passage. Let me take you over to Hosea right quick in chapter 14. The first few verses is a plea from God for Israel to return. And it's clear what attitude he wants them to return with. He says, speak these words to the Lord. Take away all iniquity. Receive us graciously, for we will offer the sacrifices of our lips. Assyria shall not save us. We will not ride on horses, nor will we say any more to the work of our hands, you are our gods. So there's the attitude that they're supposed to approach God with. And then finally, one more recognition that they're supposed to have as they come to God. For in you, in other words, for in God, the fatherless finds mercy. And then to read here in verse 17 that the Lord will have no joy in their young men or mercy on their fatherless or widows. Apparently, the people did not come back to God with the attitude that he wants them to in the first couple of verses of 14. And so therefore, he had no mercy on their fatherless, because as it says in the last part of verse 17, for everyone's a hypocrite and an evildoer, and every mouth speaks folly, even apparently those fatherless and widows.
Right. It's a very sad picture and almost total destruction. And sadly, we see that it was something that was required and justified. Good thought, Brian. Good parallel passage. All right. So as we look at this destruction, one of the other things that, again, will chip away and will begin to break them down, it will begin to cause their final destruction, is this attitude that's described here in 18 through 21. So here he says, for wickedness burns as the fire, it shall devour the briars and thorns and kindle in the thickets of the forest. They shall mount up like rising smoke. Through the wrath of the Lord of hosts, the land is burned up, and the people shall be as fuel for the fire. No man shall spare his brother, and he shall snatch on the right hand and be hungry. He shall devour on the left hand and not be satisfied. Every man shall eat the flesh of his own arm. Manasseh shall devour Ephraim, and Ephraim Manasseh. So the two main tribes of the northern kingdom will be turning on each other. Together they shall be against Judah. For all this, his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. So one of the things that I think we see is, if you think about selfishness, if you think about greed, especially when it's unprincipled, when it's undisciplined, when it's out of control, it is an insatiable appetite. And as we read about in Ecclesiastes 4 and in chapter 5, there is no satisfaction with silver or with abundance. We just continue to want more and more. So if we have a people like that, and then if you combine that with the fact that there is going to be a scarcity, there is going to be a lack of food and other things that will be upon these people, you can imagine that desperate schemes would arise, that people would begin to turn on each other. And this is something that we see as a pattern as God deals with men, especially with wicked and rebellious men that apostatize or turn away from Him. That even though they may form coalitions, God can turn them against each other. I think one of the best examples of this is in Judges 9, where Abimelech was the one that wanted to become judge and had himself put up, and he killed off all the other sons, all of his other brothers and half brothers. And then yet one of the brothers stands up and he makes a parable of all things of a forest and of all these different trees, trying to select a king to be king over them. And all of these great trees are too busy and don't have time for whatever reason. And finally, the lowest of trees, the bramble, finally says that he would do it. And one of the consequences that's described as happening in this case is that fire would come out of him and would consume all those that were involved, him as well as the men of Shechem. And here we have really the exact same illustration where these people are described as a forest and a fire being set among them and burning them up. And so we're told in verses 23 and 24 of Judges 9 that this God sent a spirit of division or ill will between them because of these events and their unjust treatment of all these brothers. So again, a pattern that we continue to see, 2 Chronicles 20, Revelation 17, 16 to 17, in the destruction of Rome. One of the things that we see there is that the people that are involved there, that even against the dragon's will or his plan, God again uses these people that are in positions of power to turn against each other and to consume Rome, to consume the harlot as she's described in that case. So this is a pattern we see in God's behavior over and over again, how he turns people against each other. 2 Chronicles 20 is a battle that happens during the days of King Jehoshaphat, and how the nations that came against him also turned against each other as well. So we see this again playing out in this case, where these people would turn against each other and consume each other, driven by greed and then just a lack of principle and discipline as well. All right, other thoughts on this question in this passage? All right, so moving along to the next one. There was these people that we've talked about over and over again. This was a problem both in Judah as well as in Israel, where we had a tremendous abuse of power. We had these judges and these leaders, and they were supposed to be people that enforced justice and provided justice to, as we talked about earlier, the fatherless and the widow. Instead, they abused that power and they actually used that to their own benefit. What was the ironic thing that was going to happen to these people?
The very rights and the mercy that they should have been willing to grant, or the help that was so needed by these people described that they had denied, would be denied to them in this day of judgment that was coming. The plunder that they had taken from them would be summarily taken away from them. Their only hope would be, or their outcomes. They were given two options there. Your outcome, you will either crouch among the captives or you'll fall with the slain. One of the two. So a very ugly picture for their denying those rights, things that were commanded directly in the law. Right. I mean, you look back to several places, Deuteronomy, or I'm sorry, Exodus 22 in verse 22. If you afflict any widow or orphan, the Lord says, I will hear their cries, and he would recompense those cries. In 23:6, just a little bit later, you must not turn away justice from the poor. So all those things listed here. Deuteronomy 24:17, you must not take a widow's garments as security for a lane. So all these groups that he's speaking of being denied justice, these men would suffer that same fate.
Right, right. I think that's it exactly. These were the people that were supposed to provide justice. People, they were to be the people that other people could come to and ask for help, ask for mercy, and they should be able to deliver it. Instead, they ignored it. And that is exactly what was going to happen to them. They were going to need mercy. They were going to be crying out for mercy, and they would have nobody to listen to. Even if they reached out to God, it would be too late at that point. And then their distinction and their power, the fact that they would be brought down to the level of everybody else, is also humiliating, even if it led in death, of course, which would be much worse. So we have woe to these people who decree unrighteous decrees, who write misfortune. They rob the needy of justice. They take what is right from the poor. And then he asks, what are you going to do in the day of punishment? To whom will you go for help? And so without God, without his help, they're going to end up bowing down among the prisoners and falling among the slain. And again, there's that refrain again. For all this, his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. So I think we have a couple of pictures of what this may have looked like. I think this form of government and justice is something we may not be as familiar with. At least it's not something I see in day-to-day life. But think about Luke 18, where Jesus gave the picture there of the unjust judge and the widow who kept coming to him for justice. And then in 2 Samuel 15, we have the picture of Absalom at the gate intercepting people coming to the king who were asking for justice. And of course, Absalom was manipulating the people. And he was saying, oh, I'm so sorry. You have a just and right case, but there's nobody here to listen to you. If I was king, I would make sure your case got heard. So, but he was doing a terrible thing, but it gives us an idea of what was happening, that these poor, the widow, the fatherless, they were coming to these leaders, and their government was set up where they could come to them for justice. They could plead their case and they could present their need. And then these people in position of power had both the responsibility and the ability to hear it and then judge in their favor. But this was something that they were not doing. And Leviticus 19:15 tells us that they would be cursed if they did not do that. And so, as we've said, having done this, rejected God, they've gained his wrath, and they're not going to have anywhere to turn. And reminded of Proverbs 1, again, 24 through 32, about the people who've rejected wisdom, and then when the destruction comes upon them and they cry out, then wisdom laughs. It's too late. So this is an insincere repentance, and repentance too late, and so the destruction is before them. And as we saw earlier in chapter 9:17, no mercy on the fatherless or the widow. So, any other thoughts or comments on this passage before we leave it?
Just one word jumps out to me there at the beginning of that verse. Woe to those who decree unrighteous decrees. This really is about righteousness and unrighteousness. God is righteous, and he wants his people to be righteous, and doing what's right. That's part of it. That's not all of it, but that's part of it. And the idea of taking advantage of people who don't have power, that's so wicked. And it's no, after they've been doing this so long, it's no wonder that we keep reading at the end of these sections, but his hand is stretched out still. He was angry.
Yes. You mentioned one thing that reminded me in Leviticus 19:15. It talks about not showing partiality to the poor, and in what you said reminded me of the thought that this is not just always giving to the poor, taking or making sure that they always win, and that they're always somehow uplifted higher. This is about doing what's right. And whether somebody's poor, as brought out in Leviticus 19:15, or whether somebody's mighty, neither one of those should play in. Righteousness and equity is what's supposed to be upheld, and that's what's expected from these people. And they're supposed to judge righteous judgment, not paying attention to what the eye sees and the ear hears, not by appearance alone. So use wisdom and judge according to the facts of the case. All right.
These injustices that we're speaking of, this unrighteousness, brings into sharp relief something we'll see later on in this lesson, but hearkening back to the beginning of chapter 9 and that coming kingdom and the promise and the hope offered there, that it would be established to uphold justice and righteousness from then and forevermore. So a very stark difference between the two.
Yes, very sharp contrast. Absolutely. All right. So why do you think this refrain keeps appearing over and over again? For all this, even after all of this punishment and this destruction, his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. When you keep seeing that over and over again, and we saw it in chapter 5 as well, that's where it was first introduced. What do you think is the point? Why does he keep saying that?
I think he's trying to drive the point home that the time for mercy is past. We talked about this some back in Stephen's class on Ezekiel. God had decided he had spent nearly 1,000 years begging them to if you'll just come back, I'll forgive everything. If you'll just come back. Mm-hmm. And they refused, and he finally said, "That's enough is enough."
Right. And so I think we see several different things in this that I think there's, to me at least, there's two main points. That the time of patience is past, that it's enough. But the other thing is this is not like they've done one thing wrong and they just this one little thing. No, this is pervasive. There is lots of different problems. This is all throughout their society. Both the rich and the poor. This is something that their entire civilization is eat up with sin. And so for both of those reasons, the abundance of sin, the fact that it's so widespread, the fact that he'd been so patient for so long, the time was up. And so it reminds me, it's not the exact same, but it reminds me of what Amos does, where he says, "For 3, yea, for 4." And so their destruction is coming upon them. So again, the idea almost that like 3 strikes and you're out. Like I'll even give you 4 strikes. And so this is above and beyond what is expected, what would be mercy, what would be patience. God's gone far beyond that. So I think it emphasizes how patient he's been, and the flip side of that is how wicked and rebellious and obstinate they've been. Good thoughts. Anything else on this one?
Just another verse to throw in from Hosea. Hosea 4, verse 18, their drink is rebellion. They commit harlotry continually. Her rulers dearly love dishonor. There was a voracious appetite for this sort of wickedness and rebellion.
Yeah.
And there was no turning back.
Yeah, there was nothing left to do. There's no way to save them at this point. Okay, so that is, maybe we should have divided this into another section, but we move from the northern kingdom, from Israel at this point, to now the threat that's coming in and taking Israel out of the way is Assyria. And Assyria is going to deal with them, as well as also become a threat now for Judah and for Jerusalem as well. And so what we see is that God is going to use Assyria as his weapon of punishment and destruction to deal with these nations. Now, one of the first things we see is how they respond to this usage. So as you read through this, do you see any awareness that they were being used as a rod of anger and a staff of indignation in God's hand? Was that their intention, or did they have some other thought in mind?
No clue. No clue at all. It was just another nation standing in their way.
Yep. I think that says it well. So he says, "Woe to them, rod of my anger, the staff in whose hand is my indignation. I will send you against an ungodly nation." And just pause there for a second. So he's talking about the northern kingdom, and then ultimately Judah and Jerusalem as well, about being an ungodly nation. And this is not the last time that we'll see God essentially lumping his chosen people in with all the other heathen nations as well. So against these people is his wrath. He's been given the charge for them to go in and to take their prey, or to treat them as prey, to take their treasure, to tread them down. Yet he does not mean so, nor does his heart think so, but it is in his heart to destroy and cut off not a few nations. For he says, are not my princes altogether kings? And then he mentions all these cities that he considers to be the same. Is not Calno like Carchemish? Is not Hamath like Arpad? Is not Samaria like Damascus? And so these cities are not listed in the order in which Assyria conquered them. They're listed in order from the northern, getting closer and closer and closer to Judah. So these are, as the threat is becoming closer and closer. So as far as like, that helps us to understand the timeline of this a little bit. Samaria fell in 722, 721. Carchemish fell in like 717. And then the siege or near siege of Jerusalem would have been about 702, 701. At least that's the dates that Haley gives us. All right, so they have no awareness of being used by God, even though the Rabshakeh, as we read about in the narrative back in historical section, even though he said, your God sent me to do this, clearly that was a lie, because they did not prosper in that. God was clearly opposed to them. And then the other thing is, when we look at the Rabshakeh's speech, it is brilliant from a wicked standpoint. He has found every source of confidence and assurance, and he's just knocking the legs out from under them, just leaving them in total doubt and just total despair. So, or it should have. So, of course, Hezekiah and those people of that day, they leaned on God. But so even though he says that God sent him, I think he's oblivious to the fact that God really did send him. He's just using that as a ploy to try to undermine their confidence. So, and again, I think that's seen, as Stan brought out, that all these cities are the same, all their gods are the same. And he makes no distinction. He's just after plunder. And this is going to be a long line. We're going to see both Assyria, and then Babylon, and then the Medes and the Persians, and then even Greece and Rome, that conquest and plunder is their desire, and they have no other thought than that. So just mention briefly that it's interesting how there is a shift, and we see this again with God's behavior, where he may send in an executioner or a punisher, and after that punishment is delivered, if that executioner or punisher, if you will, if they did it for the wrong reasons, or if they went beyond what God wanted, showing cruelty or whatever beyond what he wanted, then they themselves will end up being punished. Multitude of examples of that. Deuteronomy 32:15 through 27 to me is one of the more interesting ones, where he actually is foretelling some of this destruction and these curses. And he says there that he almost would have destroyed Israel if the enemy had not misunderstood and thought that they did it by their own power. And so it's interesting to see God's awareness of that and his concern for that people don't get the wrong idea and think that they are the source of power. So we see God humbling the ones that would, even though he's using them. Jehu is another example of someone that God used, but then they were trying to accomplish their own agenda, and then they ultimately failed because God brought justice and judgment against them for actually showing cruelty and going beyond what God asked and not being faithful, and then of course returning to the golden calves as well. So any other thoughts on this question number 19 in the passage here, and Assyria's awareness?
Jeremiah addressed the foolishness of those nations in chapter 10, when he said that those nations who failed to recognize God's indignation and fear him, he called it a discipline of delusion in the New American Standard.
That's a good passage.
That was a fitting.
Yeah, very good. All right, so why would God punish them if he's doing the very thing that he wanted them to do, that he even though they may not realize that they're accomplishing God's will, why would he punish them in this case?
I think you touched on it already a little bit there in verse 12. He says, I will punish the fruit of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria and the glory of his haughty looks. And he goes on to give us a bit of an expression of what is in the king of Assyria's heart. By the strength of my hand I have done it, and by my wisdom, for I am prudent. Also, I have removed the boundaries of the people and have robbed their treasures. So I have put down the inhabitants like a valiant man. I have gathered all the earth. So this constant focus on me and my power and my wisdom, that's why I'm so great, is because I have done all this for myself. And then, of course, God closes that out by saying, shall the axe boast itself against him who chops with it, or shall the saw exalt itself against him who saws with it? I love how you've got this great swelling attitude of this king, and God says, I've got you in the palm of my hand here, and it's like you're boasting about yourself to me. Don't kid yourself.
Yep, just a tool. So we have this boastful acts, and I think Brad has already brought this out. You see tremendous arrogance. He keeps referring to himself, and again, I think we have a personification of Assyria. This is not one king. This is not all their kings. This is representative of not just their kings, but their people. This is the way the nation thought and its leaders thought, and this is the way they looked at themselves. So a very arrogant, a very haughty people. And what he brings out is they're just a tool, and they've lost sight of that. Not that they ever really knew that, but their arrogance has overtaken them. So just thinking of a few other passages, again, this is something we see a lot. Think about Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 4. Is this not great Babylon that I've built for myself? And then God, of course, humbles him until he realizes that God sets over the kingdoms of men, whoever he chooses, even the basis of men. And Psalm 24:1 talks about all the earth belonging to the Lord. So the Assyrians thought, oh, I am taking what I want. All the earth is mine. It's my treasure. No, it's God's. He's the one who sets the boundaries, and it belongs to him. So he gives no distinction, no recognition, no thanks or honor to God. And as we said, this is a tool that's foolishly turning on its wielder. It has no power by itself. And in reality, it's God that is the one that has set the boundaries. Even as we've talked about earlier about Assyria overflowing its boundaries like a river just busting out of its banks, this is still something that they've only done because God allowed them to do this. He's enabled them to do this. But he's the one who sets the boundaries of nations, kings, and even of individuals and what we're able to do. And so I think this becomes a very powerful place to stop and think, can God be using us for accomplishing things? Not at the level that we're talking about as far as the rise and fall of empires, but whether it's preaching or teaching or some act of benevolence or encouragement, or letting our light shine, could he use us in that same way? And if we are successful in doing that, can we make the same mistake of kind of patting ourselves on the back and saying, oh, look what I've done. I'm so great. I'm so powerful. I'm so helpful to the Lord. The Lord really needs me. And can we delude ourselves and fool ourselves in that way? And I think obviously that the answer is yes. And so we have to be very cautious and very careful and recognize, even as Christians, where our power, where our strength, where it comes from. It comes from God. We are his servants. We live to serve him, not the other way around. Any other thoughts on this or other questions up to this point?
Yeah, Trevor, you on your slide here, you're just talking, saying, could God use us to accomplish his will today? I would answer that as that had better be happening in our lives.
Right.
Romans chapter 6, verse 13, Paul wrote, do not present your members to sin as instruments for unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and your members to God as instruments for righteousness. So I really, I probably shouldn't say this out on the internet. I'm not a huge fan of the song "The World's Bible," but I do think there are some good thoughts in there. Um, and the idea that God does in fact use us. How He does things providentially, I don't know, but I would be willing to guess that most of us have found ourselves in a situation where it was the right time and we had the right thing to say, or maybe we didn't choose to take advantage of the opportunity, but we still recognized it. I think very much that that's what Paul's talking about there in Romans 6.
Was it Mordecai that said salvation will come? It may not be. I mean, this may be your opportunity. Don't neglect it, but God will accomplish His purpose. I think that was your point with the song. God's not limited by what we do.
Yeah,
right. That is the case. Salvation will come from somewhere, but if it doesn't come through us, then in those cases, if we're in Esther's case, then woe to us in that case. Good thought. Anything else? All right. So we talk about the next section we go into is God. He is going to burn, and I'll go ahead and just give this away. He says, even though after Assyria has done this, it says, therefore the Lord of hosts, will send leanness among his fat ones. So even though Assyria has has pulled off these tremendous victories and obtained all this plunder and all this treasure, now they're fat, He's going to thin them out. And under His glory, He will kindle a burning like the burning of a fire. So the light of Israel will be for fire, and His Holy One for flame. It will burn and devour His thorns and His briars in one day, and it will consume the glory of His forest and of His fruitful field, both soul and body, and they will be as when a sick man wastes away. Then the rest of the trees of His forest will be so few in number that a child may write them. So we're back to this illustration of the forest and Assyria being like that. And this is a theme that we see throughout the prophets. We talked about it in Obadiah today, or Stephen talked about it in his sermon as well, is that those that try to destroy Zion, that try to destroy God's people, will end up actually destroying themselves. And in this case, He will use Jerusalem, He'll use Zion as a spark, as something to begin this fire. So this will begin the end of Assyria as they try to fall on Jerusalem. And this will be something, again, going back to the picture of the forest, the idea is it starts in the underbrush, on the things that burn very easily, but then it works itself into a large forest fire. And we can think about what we've seen on the news and things that have happened in the West Coast, how these forest fires get out of control very quickly and take days, maybe even months to try to put them out entirely. And I think it's the same kind of horrifying picture here, that Assyria is going to be eat up with this fire and destroyed by that. So what is the problem? The problem is these nations think of God and they think of His people as just any other nation, any other God. And because He's promised and selected them and chosen them, then His promise and His is going to stand through them. And so they're not going to be destroyed. And so, again, going back to the illustration from Judges, I think is also appropriate here as well, that we see people being compared to trees, and compared to plants. We have some that are low and some that are high and more noble. And this is going to get into even the greatest and the mightiest of this nation. And the idea of being of both soul and body, I think the picture here is entirely consumed. And ultimately, there's going to be very few of them left, so that even a child who can't count very high can still go around and count how many is left. So the thinning is going to begin. All right. Any other thoughts on this before we move on to the next question?
Just one quick one. Passages like this, they're terrifying. I don't want to be on the list of the Lord's enemies. It's horrifying to imagine God yeah, he is. We're told in the New Testament, he's a consuming fire. Reading things like this, boy, I don't want to be on the left side on Judgment Day.
Right, right. It's an excellent point. And that's one of the, I think, one of the wonderful things about Isaiah is that he's so graphic that it's very easy for us, and maybe it was easy for them to put away these judgments as something that are far away and we're very far removed and not relevant. But these pictures, if we will just pause and think about them for a minute, they are horrifying. They're very graphic, and they help us to realize the judgment that's coming, to make sure that we don't end up on the wrong side, as you said. So, good point. Thank you. All right. So, in contrast to Israel, in contrast to Assyria, how would things be different for the indignation that was going to be poured out on Jerusalem? They were going to suffer as well, but how would it be different?
There would definitely be an end to it. It wasn't going to be complete. They would not fall. Verse 25 interests me. For in a very little while, my indignation against you will be spent, and my anger will be directed toward their destruction. That's a very different picture than that repeated refrain we saw in chapter 9 of God's hand. I mean, I've borne with you, but. And I think he was even willing to go further if he needed to at that time, but not the case with Jerusalem. There was a definite cutoff for that oppression.
Yep. I think that's the main point, is that there would be a remnant. In this lengthy passage, I think there's a lot of good points I'll just mention. I think that's the main one that's associated with the question, at least. But notice he says that after this, that they will learn not to depend on anybody that has defeated them. So I think this is a very clear reference to Ahaz actually reaching out to Assyria for help, to help fight away the northern kingdom and Syria, Damascus, and so they would learn never to do that, but to rely on the Lord instead. That was the offer that God extended to him, but he refused that. And then there is going to be a remnant, and so depending on where you stand, that could either be good news or bad news. If you're still thinking that we're not going to be destroyed and we're not going to be punished, then this is a warning. This is shocking news that there's going to be a small remnant left. But if someone is faithful and godly and they're listening to Isaiah, they're listening to the messages of these prophets, and they understand what's happening, then that becomes a message of comfort and hope. There is going to be a remnant. There is going to be a preservation of God's plan and God's people. A remnant will return. And so even though this destruction is going to come and it's going to be decreed, we're told that it will overflow with righteousness. So again, this is going to be a justified destruction, something that righteousness will be in control of. And as a consequence, it will have a determined end as well. So I think, again, maybe an allusion to purging out and filtering out the more wicked element. So again, this point number 4 here. So ultimately, not to be afraid. Again, a message of hope and comfort, not to be afraid of the Assyrian, because eventually the indignation will pass once the work is completed. And then God is going to turn on Assyria in the same way, and he compares him to what happened at the judgment of Midian, as well as what happened in Egypt. So we're familiar with Pharaoh and his army being drowned in the Red Sea, and then also the Midianites who Gideon faced with his 300 and overcame them in the book of Judges. And there was a tremendous destruction against this great army at that time. So it will be something that will be akin to that. And again, this last point that I think is important, again, one of the things that's factoring in is because this is a special people, because God has chosen them, he's anointed them. So it could be a reference to them being a special people, as well as a reference to his plan for the Messiah, the anointed one who would ultimately appear through their heritage as well. So I won't go back through these, but they would, again, never depend on Assyria, and they would return. There would be a remnant, and eventually his wrath would stop. And then, as we said, it's going to be a miraculous judgment, a miraculous deliverance that's going to remind us of the deliverance of the Red Sea, and then Gideon and his 300. All right. Any other thoughts on that before we leave it and go to the next question? All right. So, how is Assyria figuratively depicted, and what confrontation between Assyria and Zion is foretold? So, as you go through chapter 10, 28 through 34, what is being shown to us there in the first part of that passage? What is Assyria doing?
It looks, Trevor, as if when you take the names of these places, Ioth, Migron, Michmash, Geba, Ramah, Gibeah, you can almost follow them as they get closer and closer and closer to Jerusalem. But then once we get down here to verse 32, and yet he will remain at Nob at that day. I've got a map pulled up in front of me right here. Nob is very close to Jerusalem, and he'll shake his fist at the mount of the daughter of Zion, the hill of Jerusalem. And that seems to be the account that you referred to earlier, where we have the Rabshakeh standing there on the aqueduct, and he's delivering this great speech to try to intimidate Hezekiah's men and Hezekiah himself. And that's really as far as he ever gets. As he puts it here in verse 33, behold, the Lord of hosts, will lop off the bough with terror. Those of high stature will be hewn down, and the haughty will be humbled. He will cut down the thickets of the forest with iron, and Lebanon will fall by the mighty one. Assyria is depicted as if they were this forest, this great forest of Lebanon, and God says, "No, I'm just going to cut them down." So we appear to have a foretelling of the great slaughter by the angel of the army of Assyria when they were on the very doorstep of Jerusalem, and then they have to go back home with their tail between their legs.
Yep. So I think there's, as you pointed out, there's really two pictures of this. There's two halves to this picture. One piece is you see Assyria moving closer and closer, and with that, the panic and the terror of this happening and the fear is just building. And then you have Isaiah. He's saying, "Oh, poor Anathoth." So as these cities are falling under the destruction of Assyria as they just come rolling through. Now, from history, it seems that this is not the exact path they took. I don't think that's the point. The point is this is a judgment and destruction that's just getting closer and closer, and nobody's able to stop them. Nothing is in their way, and all of the cities they care about are just being rolled right over the top of, and they'll come all the way to Nob, but that's as far as they get. And a lot of times people will focus on this word "behold." It is always a very important word, that it's calling attention to something that is very unusual, very striking. And again, this emphasizes that God is going to step in, and that he is going to act. It's going to be a day of the Lord. So again, as Brad pointed out, we have Lebanon, which is supposed to be the great forest that was at the northern border of their kingdom, the best trees, the most richest, the most luxurious. That was used in building the temple and in many very expensive projects. And so these were the tallest trees. They would be like our sequoias or our redwoods. And then yet God's just going to come in and he's just going to level them. He's just going to take their tops right off. And the terror is completely reversed in this case. So we really have a role reversal where they're coming in, they're bringing terror, and they're bringing destruction, and everybody is horrified and terrified. God is just going to step in, and then all of a sudden they are going to be the ones that will be in terror. And whereas he used to be the axe, now he's the tree. He's the one that's going to be chopped down and brought down low, or that's going to be burnt up. And so I think it's a very clear foretelling of God stepping in with the slaughter by the one angel of the 185,000. And it reminded of what he said of Hezekiah, or to Hezekiah, that not even an arrow will be shot into Jerusalem. So they got close, but they weren't even able to really lay a siege and really even begin to set up the attacks. That God stepped in, he intervened, and he brought terror upon the ones who were trying to bring terror instead. All right, good thoughts. Any other thoughts on this before we move into the next chapter, into chapter 11. All right. I don't know how far we'll be able to get. Again, like we've had in previous sections, we've had a focus on judgment and of destruction, and then oftentimes it's followed by a message of comfort, a message of hope. And so what we're going to see in this next section is God moving again to try to restore or reclaim, redeem a remnant, and him doing this the second time. And so we'll talk about what that means as we go through this section. So hopefully we can get one or two of these questions done. So Stan alluded to this a little bit earlier. In chapter 11, we read about this rod from the stem of Jesse and the branch that would come out of his roots. How is this rod, this stem of Jesse, different than these other kings and these other kingdoms that we've been looking at up to this point?
Well, it's interesting that so he's been talking about trees. He's been talking about full-grown trees, and so now here you've got a stump, which you wouldn't think. You don't think of life when you think of a stump, but there is going to be some life that's going to come out of it, and it's going to be a small branch shoot. I think it says it reminds me of what the people wanted when they wanted a king. And so God gave them Saul, who looked like a king. But then after Saul, he gave them David, who he'd kind of grown into it by then. But when he was anointed, he clearly did not fit the idea of a king. So it seems to me it's the same type thing that God is doing here.
Yep. So we have this picture of Jesus, and think of the Messiah, this rod or this stem coming from Jesse, this branch, and coming from this stump that's forgotten, that's left behind, and something mighty and wonderful is going to come from that. So just looking at chapter 11, verses 1 through 9, it's a lengthy reading, but I think we can pick out a few things really quick. So how is he going to be different? Well, the Spirit of the Lord will rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. And his delight is in the fear of the Lord. So we have somebody, at least from their abilities and their blessing, God being with them, and then what they were able to do, but then also what their heart was. This is not somebody who is all they care about is plunder and conquest and destruction. This is somebody whose motivation is to please God, is the fear of the Lord. Again, notice the way he judges, not by the sight of his eyes or the hearing of his ears, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor, with equity the meek of the earth. And then he's going to have a different set of tools, a different set of weapons as well. He'll strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall slay the wicked. Righteousness will be the belt of his loins, faithfulness the belt of his waist. And so he will be kind of held together, if you will. And the center part of who he is going to be righteousness and faithfulness. And then we have, following that, a unique king here, obviously, but then the constituents, the members of this kingdom will be very different themselves. The kingdom itself will be very different. The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb. The leopard shall lie down with the young goat. The calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze. Their young ones shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play by the cobra's hole, and the weaned child shall put his hand in the viper's den. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. So just going through this, several things that we've talked about. First of all, they got a different end. All these other kingdoms and their kings destroyed, forgotten, lost, but not this one. Even though people did forget it, this stem, this branch shot up from the stump, and David's house of Jesse was rebuilt. Different attitude, different minds. You have the blessing of the Holy Spirit upon him. So we said different weapons, but we think of the gospel as far as its ability to convict and to be able to change people. But I think there's also I can't help but think about the one who had power to speak creation into existence as well. So I think this may also be an allusion to his great power as well. But as we said, a different will or a different heart, and he would have a different standard. He would judge according to righteous judgment, not according to just appearance. Obviously, a lot of passages that we're passing over. But one thing I wanted to touch on is the last section about these different animals and the children that are able to play, and there not being um, any violence between them, which is obviously not true in our world today. And so I think what we have here is a figure, just like the rod or the sword that's coming out of his mouth is also a figure, and slaying with the breath of his lips, that's also a figure and represents something. In the same way, we have this obvious peaceful situation that is shown among people that would, or among members that would normally be very violent and very antagonistic toward each other. In places where there used to be danger, there would now be safety. And so, reminded of Matthew 18:3, where Jesus talks about, unless we're converted and become like little children, we cannot enter the kingdom of God. Have the idea of a little child leading these creatures. 2 Corinthians 5:7 talks about us being a new creation. And then the other passages here, Zechariah 8 and Isaiah 2, and then Hebrews 12. Isaiah 2, of course, we looked at earlier. I think one of the things I want to bring out is that this is something that would only happen in his holy mountain. This doesn't, two things. One, this doesn't refer to a physical kingdom. This refers to a spiritual king and a spiritual kingdom. And to try to make this a literal physical reality is to miss the point. Psalm 110:1 talks about Jesus reigning among his enemies and his people, his army being volunteers in the day of his holiness. This would be a different kind of kingdom that would permeate other kingdoms. John 8:23, Jesus saying, I'm not of this world. You're from beneath, I'm from above. And then 18:36, him saying that my kingdom is not of this world. And so this is a very different kind of kingdom. There is a tremendous peace to it, but the peace exists within the kingdom. And I think we could pull in a lot of different passages that, especially if we think about who is in the kingdom, who is in the church today. We have people that outside of the church could have been rivals. They could have been adversaries. They may have even come from warring clans and tribes, but that's not the case. These are people that have laid all that aside and now are brothers and sisters. So a very different kind of kingdom. There is now peace there where there used to be violent adversarial nature. Could say a lot more. Any other comments or thoughts on this?
You didn't leave enough room in the question for the answer to that one.
Maybe throw it right quick. I know in John, Jesus says that he defers to the Father. He's not judging on his own, but rather he's judging according to the Father. And so going back to that, the spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord resting upon him, his delight is in the fear of the Lord, and he shall not judge by the sight of his eyes. Big contrast to the folks we talked about so far. Hey, right quick, Travis Pyle chimed in and reminded us that Paul quotes in Romans chapter 9, verse 27 from a few verses back there in Isaiah 10. So the verses 22 and 23, for though your people, O Israel, be as the sand of the sea, a remnant will return. Paul is, of course, making the case. He's saying, look, this is what's going on with Israel. And if a Hebrew of those days has a complaint against God about the fact that, well, now Israel is going to wane here, and now the church is going to ascend. And as he's making his case as to what's going on there, he introduces these couple of verses from Isaiah. Though the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, the remnant will be saved, for he will finish the work and cut it short in righteousness, because the Lord will make a short work upon the earth.
It was always the plan. Yeah, and it was a plan. I think that's the point there, is that they misunderstood the plan and they didn't realize who was the special one.
Right.
Yes, an excellent point. Well, I would very much like to be able to press on, but we're out of time. So I want to close by giving you guys the last chance to make some comments or any other thoughts before we close tonight.
None for me. I'm good.
All right.
Just the fact that God is driving. I mean, that's the point. As we've gone through the minor prophets in the men's class and through this study, it is just so obvious. As Proverbs 21 maybe talks about the nations are like channels of rivers with the Lord directing. It is amazing to watch, to sit back and watch.
Yeah, he's the one that's in control, and salvation's only going to come from him, and we have no hope outside of that. Anything else, Brad?
I just throw in the verse that Stan was looking for there. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, like the rivers of waters. He turns it wherever he wishes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very good. Well, let me just close by offering thanks to you guys for participating. I appreciate the preparation and the good comments that you made. I think it really helps and adds to the class. So thank you for taking time out and joining us to do that. And let me thank the audience and those watching as well. Appreciate the time that you've invested. And I hope this helps you to have a better understanding of Isaiah and to make application to yourself so that each of us can move closer to God and be more like his son and like his Messiah that he's chosen, who leads us and is our king. So with that, I'll thank you all and wish you a good night and God bless him. Thank you all. Bye-bye.